terror attacks changed America, as Jim has been reporting. They resulted in more security at home and wars abroad. And within hours of the attacks, one group of people in the United States was beginning to realize that 9/11 would change their lives too. How did that awful day impact American Muslims? Joining us now with unique perspectives on that is Arsalan Iftikhar. He is an international human rights lawyer and the senior editor for the Islamic Monthly Magazine. Also joining us is Sahar Khamis. She is an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland. And with us too is Wajahat Ali. He is a presenter and journalist with Al Jazeera America. Welcome to all of you to the show. Arsalan, let me start with you. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks 14 years ago, was there deep concern among Muslims that there would be a backlash?
Well, there was a backlash in the first days, weeks, and months after the 9/11 attacks. Over 2,000 Arab, Muslim, and South Asian males were summarily rounded up by the George W. Bush administration under then Attorney General John Ashcroft, and even the Inspector General of the Justice Department at the time, Glenn Fine, had testified before Congress that they stopped keeping track of how many brown men they were rounding up after about 1,200 because, quote-unquote, the statistics became too confusing. I actually served as the National Legal Director for the largest Muslim civil rights group in the United States, and we were getting thousands of cases a year of young Muslim, Arab, South Asian males being pulled off of city buses and out of their college classes by men in black, not given any contact with their parents for days, weeks, and months after the 9/11 attacks. And when these families were finally given access to their sons, fathers, and husbands, many of them had their faces beaten in by all the anti-Muslim hate crimes that were happening inside prisons. And this is not even counting the numbers of hate crimes. Obviously, the first major murder happened 4 days after 9/11 when an Indian Sikh man named Balbir Singh Sodhi was shot point blank in his Chevron gas station in Mesa, Arizona. On that same day, there was an Egyptian Coptic Christian store owner in Los Angeles who was shot and killed, a Pakistani Muslim store owner in San Antonio that was shot and killed, drive-by shootings in mosques. This has been the story for the last 14 years.
Right. Sahar, one of the criticisms we've heard very often in the aftermath of those attacks is that there was not enough condemnation from Muslims and Muslim groups over these attacks, over the people who carry them out, over the ideology that drove those attacks. Yet, I've been reading some of what happened in the immediate aftermath. There was criticism, there was condemnation from major Muslim groups in this country.
Indeed, there was.
People are not hearing it.
And the interesting part is somehow there's a blind spot when it comes to recognizing the fact that Muslims are indeed in large numbers and at all levels. Religious clergy, professors, theologists, sociologists, everyone, even lay people, are definitely condemning these kinds of terrorist acts. And even now, after there have been gazillions of condemnations coming out from the Muslim world of what groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are doing, you hear people saying Muslims are not condemning enough, to the extent that one of my friends made a joke about it and said maybe we should upload some kind of, or download some kind of condemnation app that says I condemn. So every time there's an attack, we just use this app to condemn an attack. So it's a very telling joke in a way that the world has this kind of blind spot when it comes to this kind of condemnation of these attacks. But I also want to add an interesting point here. 14 years after 9/11, I teach my students at the University of Maryland in my Arab media course that somehow this kind of event was really, as much as it was tragic and very, of course, terrible, it had a double-edged effect. Meaning, on one hand, it created this kind of misperception and profiling and stereotyping of Muslims and Arabs as quote-unquote terrorists and extremists. But on the other hand, it really created a wave of interest in studying the Middle East and the Arab and Muslim world that is unprecedented. I myself was hired at the University of Maryland in an initiative to hire professors who are experts and specialists in Middle East media. And the same applies to many centers, colleges, universities that started to have Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies centers and disciplines in order to increase the interest in the Arab and Muslim world. But of course, we also have to be aware that we don't need a narrow focus on quote-unquote terrorism studies, but rather an expanded focus that looks at this important region of the world as historically, culturally, and religiously rich and diverse.
Okay, Wajahat, something else that changed in the aftermath of 9/11 was the manner in which law enforcement authorities in this country worked. Of course, we had a whole slew of laws that were introduced, and we had the Department of Homeland Security created, we had the Patriot Act passed, and in many instances, Muslim groups, Muslim individuals were targeted. We had mosques that were monitored, and they were monitored to this day in places like New York. Did Muslims get targeted for special surveillance? And did you feel that there was the police and other law enforcement agencies in this country were working on the premise that every Muslim is a suspect?
Well, you're using the past tense, but that's actually very present. Unfortunately, after 9/11, I say that Muslim Americans became the perpetual suspect. And not only just Muslim Americans, I think we should be really fair here, and Ursula made a good point about the first hate crime was Bilbir Singh. It's not just Muslims, it's anyone who I say looks Muslimi. That includes anyone who's brown skinned, anyone who's Sikh, anyone who gives the appearance of the other. And specifically, when it comes to those immigrants, or those from immigrant backgrounds, or those who were born and raised in this country with that dark hue, who looks Muslimi, indeed, they have become this perpetual suspect post 9/11 for the past 14 years. We've seen mass surveillance, as we see the Pulitzer-winning AP story that came out 3 years ago from Matt Apuzzo, where literally NYPD spent countless hours, countless time, countless money surveilling Muslim diners, Muslim students who go to prestigious universities, and what they found out as a result was no actionable threats. We've seen mosque crawlers and community rakers, those individuals who are quite literally infiltrating mosques and in plain clothes trying to find out information to quite literally convict or indict Muslims who, by the way, have done nothing except, just live their lives in a multi-hyphenated identity of being both Muslim and American. We saw the INSEERS Project. We shouldn't forget about that. That's another acronym right after 9/11, which has since been closed down, which deported essentially almost 12,000 individuals who came mostly from Muslim-majority countries. So there has this been specter of fear. The shadow of 9/11 looms large, Anand, on our law enforcement, on our domestic affairs, on our foreign policy, and specifically the way and the manner in which we speak about American Muslims and the other. It's become a civilizational conflict for some. After 9/11, Islam is at war with the West, and West is at war with Islam. And I just want to make a point that our enemies abroad, when it comes to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the #1 recruitment and the #1 propaganda tool that they have is the West is at war with Islam. Look at Gitmo. Look at what's happening with the Abu Ghraib tortures. Look what's happening with the surveillance. Look what's happening with the mosques. See, they'll never accept you because you're Muslim. And that's the same thing that's happening here with extremists like Pamela Geller and the Islamophobia Network the first time we met, is that no, Islam is at war with the West. Two sides of the same coin. Extremists beget extremism, and in the middle, which is the rest of us, the moderates, the normal folks, the moderate Muslim, right? The mythical moderate Muslim, the moderate American, we burn in the middle.
Arsalan, there was a story in Atlantic Magazine, and it cites a survey that was done by Pew Research, and the survey was done actually in 2011, which was 10 years after the attacks, and it says that the majority of Muslims at that time believe that it's difficult to be a Muslim in the United States. That is still the case.
Yeah, I mean, we had stories of Muslim women who wear the hijab, the headscarf, who were accosted by bat-wielding gangs after 9/11. We have, again, people who were attacked solely based on their name or their ethnicity, and they might not even have any sort of affiliation or any, aside from being named Muhammad or Ahmed, to any sort of Islamic identity. There have been a lot of public opinion polls that have come out that show that today, Muslims are the most despised demographic group in America. The Pew Center comes out with a yearly study on Americans' attitudes towards religious demographic groups, and historically speaking, atheists have always ranked last place in that study, and Muslims always second last. This last year was a seismic shift because for the first time in history, atheists actually ranked above Muslims by 1 percentage point. So just think about that for a second, that a group of people that literally does not believe in God is considered a more favorable religious demographic group in America today than Muslims are. And so that's a seismic shift.
Yeah. And add to that, not just the negative attitude, but also the ignorance. There's very, very little knowledge about Islam and Muslims among the mainstream average Americans. I also want to add that some of the surveys showed, interestingly enough, that when the American public was, given a statement that said, who is an American Muslim? They said, an American Muslim is someone who's hardworking, coming to this country to make a future, work hard, be a good citizen, and so on. So who is a Muslim American? How do you define a Muslim American? Oh, an alien, someone who's an immigrant coming from another country, probably people of color, marginalized. They're not really fitting well or integrated into the society. So even the switch in terms of whether you call the person American-Muslim or Muslim-American makes a difference in terms of the perception that they receive from a wide strata of the public, which is very interesting when you think about it. What are the implications of this?
Can I give a different perspective on this?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Look, a sobering point is that the favorability rating of Islam was higher in the month after 9/11 than it is now. And I want your viewers at home to really sit there and think about that. But at the same time, when you asked about the success of American Muslims, or if it's okay to be an American Muslim, or if it's easier, look, the American Muslim story...
What caused that to change?
Well, the research shows that actually a month after 9/11, and this is one thing that I'll praise George W. Bush for. Yes, I said I will praise George W. Bush for this one thing, that he actually made a very concentrated effort as the commander-in-chief.
Well, stop right there. I'm going to play you a soundbite of what George W. Bush said. Let's watch this.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah.
So despite that, attitudes changed significantly.
Yeah, well, that was the one good thing he did, and of course there were unnecessary wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and of course made the United States to this day still a boogeyman in most of the Muslim majority countries. But what we've seen as a shift, and we've done the research on this, is the following. It was bad, of course, but then there was a spike, especially, if you will, after 2008. There was the economic recession in America, number one. We had the election of Barack Hussein Obama, who is not a Muslim, even though 54% of Republican voters, according to the latest poll, think he's a Muslim. We also saw the manufactured Ground Zero mosque controversy in 2010, right before the midterm elections. That was neither a ground zero nor a mosque, manufactured quite deliberately by the Islamophobia network, which resulted in about 150% increase in anti-Muslim crimes as studied by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Right. What we've also seen is the rise in sensationalistic violence by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. You combine that together, and there's a segment of America which says, this country no longer belongs to me. There has been a huge rise in the past 5 years in white supremacist, anti-immigrant, and anti-government hate groups. And specifically, this is tied together with an anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, and anti-Muslim sentiment that is rising. You take it all together, and Islam as the brand name, as Arsalan and others were talking about, becomes toxic, it becomes the orc, it becomes the bad guy, and it's up to American Muslims. And I think American Muslims, this is where the success story comes. Despite all this, we're still resilient. We're still succeeding. 10% of American physicians are Muslim. You see more Muslims engaged in politics, on media, really taking the mic and becoming the protagonists of their own narrative. And literally, American Muslims still say that despite all the tension, we're still optimistic about America's future. Right.